problem of induction. Induction is the logical process of, let me move on here. The root process of induction is the process of generalizing from what we have observed about a certain group or set of things that have something in common, and generalizing that what we observe about them is true of all the members of that group or set of all that kind. We observe, we test the melting point of copper. We find out that it's 1,083 degrees centigrade. And we generalize that that's a melting point of copper per se. All copper everywhere will melt at that temperature, assuming the conditions are comparable to the one we did the test on. All people are mortal. How do we know that? Well, we observed a lot of people, but we haven't observed any future people. In all these cases, in both cases and in the many other ones that we have, we infer, generalize from a sample to a whole population, to use the language of statistics, from some members of a class to all members of the class, from some S, observing that some S are P, to the conclusion all S are P. And here's the problem. When we generalize, we seem to be going beyond our evidence by the very definition of statement of what we're doing. Our conclusion covers things that we have not observed. If they're future events, future objects, we can't observe them yet, obviously. So what justifies us in doing this? What's our basis? Now, you can see that it's a serious problem, because if we can't rely on induction to draw general conclusions, such as all men are mortal, or chairs support the weight of a normal human being, or copper melts at its 1,083 degrees centigrade. If we can't support those generalizations, then we cannot engage in the other main logical type of inference, deduction, which is taking a general statement and drawing from it, applying it to a particular case or subclass, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. Actually, for us, he's now in the sample class. I think at the time this hoary old syllogism was invented, he might not have been. I can't remember exactly when that came up. Okay. With that, let me move on to the skeptical challenge. It was mounted by David Hume. Hume was not the first to mount it. In fact, I discovered when I was looking into the history of Islamic philosophy after 9/11, that essentially all of Hume's arguments and positions were anticipated by an Islamic philosopher, a famous one, writing, I think, in the 10th century, 11th century. But in any case, Hume is the arch skeptic, and here's how he proceeded. Hume argued that there are no necessary connections among events. In his words, all events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we can never observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. So we have no rational justification for generalizing beyond the range of our immediate perceptual experience. The fact that we've seen the sun rise every day up to this point gives us no rational basis for assuming it will rise tomorrow. The rising of the sun after the falling of the sun at night is the two separate events. One's always followed the other. Maybe it'll go on. The fact that bread has nourished us, to take another of Hume's examples, in the past is no guarantee that it will continue to do so in the future. We have no guarantee that it will not be toxic the next time we swallow it, or rigid and unswallowable. The regularities that we observe, in effect, on Hume's view, amount to a kind of metaphysical coincidence, that things just seem to keep happening in the same sequence, like, drawing a series of aces from a deck. So that's Hume's position. Those are his conclusions. The question is why? Why did he say that? Well, his main argument I'm sorry, like, one further point about his conclusions. Because he doesn't think that causal necessity exists out in the world, that there are literally causal connections between one event and another, or between a thing and what it does. He says, well, where do we get this impression, the strong impression we have that when we observe one billiard ball, for example, hitting another, that the second one had to move off, that it was forced or compelled to move off by the impact of the first ball? He says, well, it's not justified by anything we can see in reality, so it must be imposed on what we perceive by a mental habit, an association. In his words, after a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect its usual attendant and to believe it will exist. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. So it's a subjective layer that's imposed on what we actually observe. So back to my question, what are his reasons for this position? Well, his main argument was simply to ask us to observe very carefully what we observe in perception. Imagine, says Hume, that you had never seen water before. Could you tell, just by looking at the water, observing its fluid and transparent character, that you could not breathe under it? That it would suffocate you if you held your head down? No, he says. Where would that idea come from? The water is one thing. Suffocating is another thing. You can't deduce the one from the other. So the first time that you saw water, you wouldn't know that. Or again, if you were seeing fire for the first time, all you had available to your perceptual, to your senses, is the visible color and the flame. Could you tell that it would burn you if you put your hand in? No, he says. The cause and the effect are just distinct things. Well, very well, you might say, okay, but once I do observe what happens, then I can generalize. I can see that they're connected. Once I see the one, then the other, and maybe a couple repetitions. I see the connection as a result of multiple occasions of observing the behavior. So once I put my hand in the flame, I won't do it again. That would be typical one-time toddler learning because it hurt. But still, Hume says, okay, that's what we do, but can you actually see the connection? You see the flickering yellow flame of the fire. You feel the pain when you put your hand in it. Do you, on top of that, see a connection? Like a little between the flame and the burn, the pain? No. You just see what's there. You see the flame, you feel the heat, you feel the pain. You observe one billiard ball colliding with another. You see the motion of the first ball, the point of contact, and the second ball moving off. What you see is two motions. One follows the other. Is there some necessity you see? No, again, he says. So he says the mind can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause, for the effect is totally different from the cause, and consequently can never be discovered in it. Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from motion in the first. Now, underlying this argument of Hume's, this is as far as he went in the argument, but if you look more closely at his assumptions, you see that there is actually a philosophical assumption at work behind this, and I want to mention it briefly because it's important for our different understanding of cause and effect. And that assumption is called sensationalism. I want to focus our attention now on what's called the law of causality. And that law, I think the best formulation of it is that every event has a cause and that the same cause has the same effect. All right? The first part says that events and actions do not occur randomly. The occurrence of an event and the particular nature of that event depend on something that causes it, whatever that might be. And secondly, the law of causality says that the same cause has the same effect. There is an actual connection such that once we have discovered the factor responsible for a certain effect, that factor will always, in the same circumstances, continue to have that effect. So if we know that the law is true, we can answer Hume quite easily. We might even agree with him. I'm not necessarily saying this, but for the sake of argument, let's suppose we agree with Hume that we don't literally perceive causality, even with the richer notion of perception that I've outlined. I see the fire, I feel the pain, I don't literally perceive some relation of necessity over and above those. But I can generalize because the law of causality. Once I know that it's the flame that burned me, I can generalize that the same cause will have the same effect. So Hume will now ask the obvious question. What justification do you have for believing in the law of causality? How could we validate the law? And his main argument is that you can't justify it by inductive reasoning because that would be circular. If we try to the law of causality is a fully abstract statement. It applies to everything that exists, past, present, or future. And every action, every type of entity, it's fully general. How would we support that generalization? I mean, if you think fire burns is a generalization that's in trouble epistemologically, this is way, way up there. I mean, if you're trying to argue, well, this flame burned me and that flame burned me, so flames burn, okay, that's one thing. And then every morning the sun has arisen, so the sun always rises. That's another causal connection. And every egg that I've dropped is broken, so there's another causal connection. So I guess everything's causally connected. The same effect will always have. Hume will turn around and say, wait a minute. Every one of your individual generalizations is dependent on the law of causality, and then you're putting all those generalizations together to have a higher level generalization about all the possible actions in the world. You have taken out a huge cognitive loan in going beyond any possible actual perceptual evidence that you've had. So how do you justify that? And most philosophers have said that you can't, and they have not paid any more attention to the law of causality. But in the Aristotelian and objectivist framework and tradition, we do. We think it's very important. It's actually axiomatic, and I want to just outline, why that is the case. First of all, to say that the first part of the law, as we saw, says that all actions have causes. To say that an action has a cause is to say that it's produced by something, that it is a dependent phenomenon. It's not a self-sufficient existent in the way that a thing or an entity is. And that's precisely what our perceptual experience tells us about entities and their actions. There are no actions without an acting thing. Actions in that sense, like qualities, depend on, they exist only as features of an entity. That's the first level of dependence. And that's why we can be sure that every event has a cause, because events are not self-subsistent existing things. Secondly, or building on that, if actions depend on the entities that act, then they have to depend on the identity of the thing. Why? Because the thing just is its identity. There's no gap between a thing and what it is. A thing is what it is. It is literally just its own nature. If it's for example, to take our stock example, if it is the heat of the flame that causes the pain, as anyone under the age of 5 has long since discovered. Not the color, not the shape, but the heat of the flame, the temperature. That temperature is part of the identity of the flame. The flame actually is an interesting kind of example for our issue, because it's perceived as visually in object terms, even though it is a process, but it has the color effect makes it look like a thing. But it is an entity. It is a unit that we discriminate, and its thermal properties are a feature of, let's say, the burning candle or the burning stove. So that means that the same entity in the same conditions, if its nature has not changed, will have to act in the same way. Because if the action depends on the attribute of the thing, and the attribute hasn't changed, then what depends on that attribute won't be different. The essence of causality is dependence on the nature of the things that act. Now, of course, most of the events that we use as examples, such as the billiard ball collision, involve more than one entity. And so we say we take the motion of one, and then the motion of the other begins. But what's happening here is two billiard balls. These are balls of a certain kind. What happens because of their rigidity, and as we now know, the momentum, the mass times the velocity of the ball, which scientists have discovered is a quantity conserved, essentially in this isolated context, we can treat it as a conservation momentum issue. But what we observe, we don't observe all that perceptually, but what we do observe is the fact that the rigidity of the cue ball and of the object ball is what makes the motion of the first lead to the motion of the second. If we replace the object ball with a painted Easter egg, the result would be very different. If we replaced it with a piece of high-powered explosive that was shaped like a billiard ball, the effect, once again, would be very different. So it is even in this case of one event seeming to cause another event with no perceptible connection, we do perceive the rigidity and the speed of the objects, and those, in fact, are what make the event happen the way it does. So I want to end with what I think is the best single statement of this point and of the argument. It's not really an argument, by the way, what I was just laying out. Go back to the slide. This is not really an argument. It's because I'm just pointing to something that's implicit in the law of identity and the nature of what we perceptually grasp. It's just putting things together, guiding us through the articulation of what we can observe directly. And a very, very good philosopher named H.W.B. Joseph, Oxford professor in the early part of the 20th century, wrote a book called the Introduction to Logic, in which he has a chapter on the presuppositions of induction, from which this passage is taken. If a thing A, under condition C, produces a change X in a subject S, remember, this is a philosopher speaking, the way in which it acts must be regarded as a partial expression of what it is. It could only act differently if it were different. To say that the same thing acting on the same thing under the same conditions might yet produce a different effect is to say that a thing need not be what it is. But this is in flat conflict with the law of identity. A thing, to be at all, must be something and can only be what it is. To assert a causal connection between A and X implies that A, the object, acts as it does because A is what it is, because in fact it is A. So long, therefore, as it is A, it must act thus, and to assert that it may otherwise, I'm going to, I skipped a passage in the slide because it wouldn't fit, but I'm going to read it anyway. So long as it, therefore, as it is A, it must act thus. In short, the law of causality is a law of identity applied to action. Yeah, I don't know if this is the first statement of that point that Ayn Rand also invokes, but it is, I think it is a very powerful statement of it. And it essentially encapsulates the background of causality, the very fundamental level at which we can be certain that the world is governed by causality. Now, tomorrow I'm going to move on to talk about some more specific issues in identifying causal relationships and look more closely at the specific issue, can we perceive, and what would that mean? But for now, I will stop, and do we have any time for questions? Okay.